And we are live. So, yesterday, this is a continuation of what we were doing yesterday. So we created this rig using a node and an armature object which controls a simple animation. So that was yesterday. Link will be provided in the description once this goes, well, once this is archived. Excuse me. So what we did, we had our mesh, and in edit mode, whoops, wrong one. In edit mode, we created two vertex groups. One for the top, or the torso, and the other controlling the feet. The rig has two bones that correspond to those elements. So we've got two bones. The lower's called feet, the upper is called torso. And these control the mesh through those vertex groups. So when we select one and we're in pose mode, when we manipulate them, they control different aspects of the mesh. And we know this works when we exported to FBX. We imported this into IMVU. Slow, computer, slow. Computer says no. Turkey Bob. It's loading the project. So that's the turkey exported using the basic setup that we have in IMVU, in Blender. So root furniture node, which controls everything, armature parented to that, and then the mesh is parented to the armature. So there's a hierarchy of objects. And that exports to FBX, keeping that hierarchy so that we end up with an object that we can animate. And in this instance, Turkey Bob. So this is triggered, Turkey Bob, by text. Now, as this only has two bones, let me just reset that to stop the animation, because it's on a loop. Once you trigger it, it'll keep looping until you change one of the settings or move the furniture item. I think that stops the animation. But with that basic setup, we can do simple animations. So even with two bones, if we wanted to, right click the armature, switch to pose mode. If we wanted to, even though it just bobs up and down, we do have a certain amount of control over exactly what it does. So position the bone, location rotation, and that'll give us multiple axes that we can animate across. Let me just copy that pose. Copy. Paste. And insert. And this will loop. So that's 80, 80. So 80. And then if I just do Alt A, it'll loop rather slowly at the moment because the computer's doing all sorts of things to stream the broadcast. But if we want to do something more sophisticated with this, we'd have to adjust the armature to compensate. So, for example, if we want the bird to hop, part of that pose, part of the actual hop pose, might mean the legs of the bird tilting. But because we've only got 2 bones, if we tilt the legs, we also tilt the feet, so they'll drop below ground level. So we need to adjust this by adding a control bone or another bone that controls only the feet, which will allow the legs to move. Texture, let's do wireframe. It'll allow the... Actually, what I'll do is I'll switch the theme to make the lines easier to see. There we go. Oh, that hasn't really... Grid's a bit too dark. But in tilting the feet bone, or the bone that's associated with the whole object of, or the whole sub-element, the feet sub-elements, the feet themselves, or the claws, toes, dip below the horizontal. To avoid that, we have to modify the armature by adding some extra bones. So, to do that, we need to... So I'll reload this file. 18. Alright, so that's reloaded. So what we need to do is armature selected, edit mode, and that puts us into edit mode so that we can modify the bones. And we can do one of 2 things here. We can either right click the bottom node, which I think is the head of the bone, and extrude a bone from that, or we can just Control A, Shift A, and another bone will be added, but it'll be tiny because of the scale difference between IMVU and Blender's defaults. So let's just undo that. So a simple method, or a simple way to do this, might be just to right click select the foot bone, and using Shift D we just duplicate that and create an extra bone. Right click just to reset it, and then press your R key, or using the rotate widget, rotate it round so it's horizontal. So we really want this to be horizontal on the... so it's facing forward. We want to keep the head of the bone approximately where the leg, this part of the mesh, where that joins, or where there's an effective joint between the leg and the actual toes. In fact, what we could do, because this area will act as a pivot or a location where this part of the mesh will pivot. So what we can do here is move this up to about there, and move or decrease the size of the leg bone. Right click the head node and move that up so that it approximately matches. And so what we should have is this now pivots around that point, but this one doesn't move. So what we can next do, we have to change the relationship between the bones, because this, the one that's selected, needs to be connected to this. So right click, we'll call this toes actually whilst we're doing this. So object properties, not object properties, we want bone properties. That one, toes. So that's called toes. And we want it to be the parent of, so in the relations subsection of bone properties or properties, click the parent icon and select feet from the list, or whatever the name of that bone is that's now selected. So if we move this in edit mode, oh, it's because it's not connected. We don't need to do that, if I remember correctly. Just double check what that does. Yeah, so undo that. Doesn't need to be connected, it just needs to be linked. So this bone is the child of this bone. Because what we can now do, edit mode for the mesh. We've already got the legs selected, but we need to create another vertex group. So add, and we want to select the feet or the toes. So control left click for your loop select. That'll select all the feet, and then just assign, double check. We'll also make sure, we'll need to make sure that the feet group that's still assigned to this section of the mesh, we need to disassociate or remove this group from this, this selection. So using your group that you've just created, left click select, then use the select deselect buttons, then select the feet group and remove. So that now has no influence over that section of the mesh, but it still influences this section, which it still carries the feet. Might rename that to legs, but we'll have to adjust the bone then. Right, so double click, rename that toes. And that corresponds to that bone, which is also called toes. And this should, yep, because we've already parented, because the mesh was previously parented to the armature, we don't need to do anything in terms of any further parenting, because the relationship between the mesh and the armature that controls it is already set up. So long as your vertex groups and your bone names are the same, it should automatically influence the bone. Bone articulation should automatically influence. Pardon me. It should automatically influence the mesh. So we need to check that we don't have any issues with the articulation. Because what we want to avoid because of the way that the mesh, or the yes, the mesh was made. Alright, that's right. So the way that we set this up, the feet bone is essentially the master bone of the rig. So if we move that, it moves the entire object. So to articulate the feet, we have to move those separately. But the reason for checking this is to check for gaps in the mesh, because the character was set up in a way that didn't compensate for that degree of articulation. So we have to go into edit mode, vertex select, and just drop these down a bit so that we have some room or some overlap that compensates for the tilt that we're going to get. You might need to, well, double check where we don't need to do it for the legs at the top here, but you would need to double check things for things like that. So once you've got your let's save the file. Actually, save the file, save as. This is 20 because we've already got 19. Yeah, because what you could do, I mean, depending on how you wanted the character actually to animate, whether you wanted more complex animations. This is just a very simple control armature. If you wanted more animation or more complex animation, you'd have to start thinking about the way that the armature is set up, so that, for instance, you might want separate leg bones, separate feet bones, and if you were going to do something with the head, the eyes, the beak, the wings, the tail. But you don't necessarily have to create that from the get-go, because you can adjust or make adjustments once you see that something works. So we know that the original rig, we know that this works because we've been able to bring it into IMVU. So we know that works. So it's then just a question of making adjustments to this that exported to IMVU to compensate for whatever it is that you want the animation to do. Question in chat: does it matter which part of the bone connects to another one, so head to tail or head to head? It matters in so much as it changes the positional relationship between the bones, because as you saw with this, if we connect if we connect the toe bone to the what is essentially the leg bone, I think we'll rename that to the leg bone, it jumps up to the top there, which basically now means that we've changed the pivot point for the bone. So although this this leg bone controls the entire armature, the pivot point for this bone has now changed. So in terms of your relationships pivot point wise, where things rotate and move, you want to check the bone relationships in terms of parenting. So this selected bone, the toe bone, is a child. Well, it's not at the moment because it's connected, but it's a child of the foot bone. And whilst it's connected, it will do other things, but not being connected, it can be moved on its own, which is useful for like if this was a full character rig, you could create a separate element for the legs. So you could move the torso bone in pose mode, you could move the torso bone and it wouldn't necessarily affect the legs. So that's in terms of the relationships, that's what you want to pay attention to really, is not so much the relationships hierarchically, rather how the connection between the two between bones changes the pivot point and how the bone articulates. Because if you did leave it like this, then you'd have to probably turn the armature upside down or start the armature using a bone, because we don't have a master bone in this. The master bone is the root node, the furniture item. That's our master bone, which is a replacement for the bone that's lying flat on its back. That's the root bone in when you use an armature. Well, for Cal 3D export, that bone is now replaced by the node. So when you create your armature, that changes the relationship behavior between the bones. So did we just double check that? So we've given ourselves, we might have to do a bit more there actually, because so mesh, just drop that down a little bit more. Okay. So this will allow us to do a hop. We'll create a hop. The character will hop along. Right, so that's the basic rig modified with just the addition of a single bone, and that's about as much as you need to do depending on what it is that you want the character or the actual object to do. In this instance we just need it to hop, but to compensate for preventing the feet from dropping below the horizon, we need to add that extra bone. So now how many sequences do we have? We don't have another one. Right, so we have to create another action sequence. So this one's called Turkey Bob, which is it just bobbing up and down. And we need to create another one. So click the plus symbol. That'll duplicate this one and create a unique instance of it, and we can call this Turkey Hop. Turkey Hop. Make sure fake user, that's the button with the F, make sure that's active. And then what we can do is just right click this keyframe node, right click and just press delete to get rid of it. And we want delete keyframes. So what we've got is basically two frames running across, well, duplicate frames running across 60 frames. And that differs from Turkey Bob, which carries the original keyframe positions. So for the hop, make sure your sequence is selected. Choose a midpoint. We might actually need to modify the armature again, because this bone is attached to feet. Because what we want to do, we need to be able to modify the position of this, the vertical position, but we can't do that whilst it's connected. So edit mode, we need to disconnect that. It still keeps the parent relationship, so the master bone or the feet bone still controls everything. But doing that allows us to move the torso independently of the feet. So what do we? How do we want to do this then? So frame 20. Let's create a compression. So all we need to do is just move this down. So that's left click, drag one of the widget handles and insert the keyframe. So press the I key or animation, insert keyframe, and in the pop-up that appears we want location, rotation. So we get this action at the moment. And then what we can do next, so we've got the compression, so it bobs down and then it should spring back up. So we want to reset the position of this. So we can do that by clearing the rotation location information. That's Alt G or animation. Where is, oh there it is, clear transform, clear all. So you've got these shortcuts to clear location, rotation and scale. So that's Alt G, Alt R and Alt S. And that'll just reset. Insert your keyframe so that you've got a pose there. So it's just bobbing up and down. But this is a hop, so we want to move this up. Insert that new keyframe. But because we've changed the position of the feet, we're getting a slight... So we need to reset that. insert that keyframe to fix that that bone's location so it doesn't move. So this is where you need to start thinking. So this is a simple animation, but just from this you can see how you have to start thinking about how the different parts of something work in relation to the action that's being performed. So what should happen here is that his legs should be reset at this point, because what he should be doing is bobbing down and his body should pop up and his legs should follow, but they should extend before it gets to the top there, but it doesn't do that. So how do we solve this problem then? Because of the way that we've rigged this, so that frame, I wonder if an easier way to do this might be to reset that, insert the keyframe there. Yeah, there we go. That's a bit better. So this feet bone, I'm going to rename that legs. Legs. Which means we probably have to... Oh no, has it done it automatically? Yep, it's automatically changed the name of the vertex group. Right, so the leg bone is essentially the control. So if we want the body to bob in relation to the legs, we really have to position the legs first and then position the body relative to what the legs are doing. And then what we can also then start doing is, so when it drops, it's going to spring down or compress. So we can put another keyframe for that. And then it'll reset, so we can copy the frame that's at frame 1 with this bone selected, or we can select all of them actually because we'll need them. So press the A key. Make sure at least one of them is highlighted as the active element, and then use your copy paste buttons. That copies the pose. And that pastes it. But it doesn't paste the keyframe. We have to insert that. This will look a little odd because of the computer is having to work on streaming and doing animation sequences at the same time. But we also want to start maybe tweaking. So as it jumps up, we can tilt its legs, its feet, which will need to be reset for some of the other keyframes. So that's Alt-R. If you don't want to keep pressing the I key to insert keyframes, what you can do is go to the timeline editor, and down at the bottom we've got this section. So enable auto insert keyframes. It'll insert the we want keyframe, and then click on this pair of keys, and we want location and rotation. It'll give us a lot of other options, but the ones that we want, or the ones that we can use, are location and rotation. And that basically means that whenever you do something to a bone, it automatically inserts the keyframe. Switch back to Dope Sheet, which is set to the action editor. So if I just move that to another frame and move the bone, if you watch what happens down here, a keyframe is automatically inserted, and that saves you having to constantly pressing the I key, or pressing the I key, or pose animation insert. So let's continue with this. So we need to compensate or fix the fact that that's rotating before it should do. So we can right click select, copy the pose, want to move it to the frame just before it pops up, paste the frame, and again this will insert a keyframe automatically. And because those two are the same, we get the orange highlight. And we need to copy it and paste it to there as well. And that is our hop. We could probably yeah, so that's your basic animation. It just hops up and down. So let's save this. Save as 21. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because depending on how you want this to, if you wanted this to move as opposed to just hopping up and down, if you wanted this to move, you'd need to set up the armature in a slightly different way, because where's the monster mash? Okay. So these are just pose markers. each one of these is an individual mesh, and they move semi-independently of one another. And that works because each one is controlled by its own node. So this is a furniture item. So as we discussed in the previous video, the furniture item's position within IMVU is controlled by the root node. And then everything else is relative. Everything else is then positioned relative to the root node. So if you, I don't know if how visible these are. But you can see the relations line, this faint dashed line that links the selected node, that links the nodes to the root node, which lets you know that the root node is in control of all of these. So each one of these has a relationship line. So the meshes, they move because they're controlled by the nodes. So we can do one of two things with our Turkey if we wanted it to move. We could either create another node or use the one that we had before if we'd still got it in the file. I think we must have, I think we hid them. Yeah, I think we hid them. If you wanted this to move, what we could do is add a second control node that's parented to the root node, which the armature is then parented to. So what this does is it allows us to it basically means that the forward, so if you wanted the turkey to hop forward, you can do it in one of two ways. You can either do it with the turkey's armature, so that would mean setting up the animation so when it hopped, you'd actually be moving the root node, which is the legs. But the problem with that is that what you end up doing is creating a pretty large animation file for this object. So the hop, the up and down, is also part of the motion. But you can simplify your project by essentially creating, I have to reset that. You can simplify the project by essentially making a looping hop animation. So the bird, all the bird does is hop up and down. That's it. That's all it does. But its forward motion is controlled by the furniture node. So if we've probably still got them in the file. Yeah, so if I hide that, yeah, we've still got the nodes that we added previously. We could probably use one of these. And what you would do is you create your character specific animation for the mesh, and then you control its forward motion or whatever it is that you want it to do using the furniture node. Question in chat, hang on. Screenshot. I'm not sure what that's showing, Frenzy. So let me just drag this over to move to new window. Whoops. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. Normally when your textures don't show like that, it means that the UVs haven't been done properly. So I'd guess that's probably what's going on without looking at the file. But yes, Hot Rod, that's, yeah, so you essentially create two animations, and that gives you a bit more control over how the character then behaves in IMVU, because what you can then do is create multiple animations for just a single cube and keep the relatively complex animation for the armature. So we can do that, but we need to change the relationship structure of the scene for all the objects that we're using. So switch out of pose mode, so that's Control Tab, or use the mode selector. And then what we need to do is right click the armature, right click the node. So if you don't have one, just add empty and then cube, and it'll add a cube, and you might have to resize it. Parent the two together. It's object, parent, object, and then object cube transform. So we've now got this node controlling the armature as an object, which controls the mesh as an object. So we're creating a hierarchy of objects as our skeletal structure that IMVU will use. So we might need to rename that. So right click, Turkey control, or Turkey root. So Turkey root is then parented to the furniture root. So shift right click your Turkey root, then shift right click the furniture root and parent that. So that's Control P. Keep transform. So now we have furniture root controls the entire object, or the entire project, shall we say. Turkey root controls the turkey, armature, mesh, and then armature controls the mesh. So we've got our hop animation, that's still in place. Oh, save the file before we do it. Save as. Get into the habit of creating saves so that you have restore points to go back to. And then all we need to do is right click the control node of the turkey, set our frame position to 1, and then we want to initiate a pose. In fact, actually we need to, oh, it'll do it automatically, I think. So if I insert, yeah, so it's automatically created an action sequence for us by pressing the I key and initiating the insertion of a keyframe for the position of this node. So we can call this turkey hop, or turkey hopping. Make sure fake user is active, so click the F. So that's our first frame. Yeah. So it's DJ Deb said that it looks like a wind-up toy, the character. I guess that's what Future Armor or Matt Groening, however you pronounce his name. Right, so back on track. So we are creating our motion, forward motion or backward motion or whatever it is, by manipulating the node. We're not doing anything anymore to the armature for the character, just the node. So right click, and we can ignore what the character is actually doing, because that's not part of this particular sequence. So move the node and it'll automatically insert keyframe. And what you want to do is just basically block out how you want this to move. Oops. Remembering to move your cursor so that you insert a clean frame, and just mark a frame, in this instance with the feet bone selected, or the leg bone. All I'm doing is pressing the G key just to initiate free translate and just repositioning the object. Oh, hang on, did we just override? Yeah, I think we just overrode that, so that was Control Z or Control Z, that undoes. Undo. And for the last one, you can duplicate the current position. And we do that in a similar way to the armature having copy paste buttons when it's in pose mode. That's these three. Nodes have their own copy paste, but you can't do that within the 3D view. You have to do it within the action editor. So move the scrubber to frame 1, copy, and then move it to where you want it to be and paste. And what that tends to do is copy paste all the frames, which we don't want, so press the B key, that's your box select, and delete. I think actually we just deleted the... So which one's frame 1? That's frame 1. So delete that. So that should be... And it's not. Okay, so you just create... Oh, it is. Right, so what you end up with then is it just moving, and you want it to return back to the point it was at. So it's the node that's moving. But now, once you've blocked out the path that you want it to take, you can now start to adjust the rotation. So that needs to be a bit more that way. And this is where it can get a little tricky and a little confusing. The temptation is, once you've, so this is the, it started from a forward facing position. Next keyframe, it's still facing forward. Now because this is moving to, well, it's to our left, but it'll be its right side, isn't it? Yeah. So it's rotating to its left. So it has to rotate to its left. Once you start doing that, you have to continue with that. Is that clockwise? Well, you have to continue rotating it in the same direction that the character is intending to turn. So with our blockout pose, you might be tempted to rotate it that way. But watch what happens when it tweens between the previous frame. It spins. Because to Blender, what you've essentially done is rotated it anti-clockwise when it should be rotated clockwise. Because in Blender, I don't know how clear this is on screen, but in Blender it doesn't do a full 360 degrees like it might do in other applications. It does 180. So from 0, if you go clockwise around the face of a clock, so 0 is midnight, 12 o'clock, 6 is 180 degrees on the positive, so that would be plus 180. But from 6 o'clock continuing on through 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and back to midnight, you're not actually going 180, 190, 200, 210, 20, 30, 40, 50. You're not going that way around. You're actually inverting the rotation. So it actually flips, because it's essentially looking at a clock. Blender doesn't look at circular rotation in 360 degrees. It looks at it as if you've cut the face of a clock in half. So the right half from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 or through to 6, that's plus 180. And then from 6 to 12, so 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that's negative 180. So if you rotate, depending on how you rotate this, whatever it is that you're rotating, even though it may make sense in terms of the degrees with which you are rotating the object, so you might think you are rotating it 270 degrees, to Blender you're not actually doing that. You would be rotating it 180 and then minus however many degrees there are between, so 270, that would be minus 90. So Blender would be looking at the final resting position of the character not as 270 degrees, but it would be looking at it as minus 90. And if it's minus 90, it's telling, the minus indicates that it's an anti-clockwise rotation. So it can take a bit to get your head round, but that's something to bear in mind. But the easy way to think about it is that once the character starts to turn, you need to turn it or continue the rotation in the direction that you initially set up the rotation. So what I'll do is clear that rotation, so that's Alt R, so it's now facing the way that it was. So from that position to that position, we need to continue the rotation so that it faces the right way. Yes, widget. DJ Deb's just saying the widget using the widgets. Yeah. You can do it freeform, which is just pressing the shortcut keys R, G, and S, and then you control your rotation or whatever it is that you're doing by pressing X, Y, or Z, or Z. But for these kinds of things, it's sometimes just easier just to use the widgets. So you've got your transform or translate, rotate, and then scale. We don't use that really for animation. So let's continue. Oh, and also, to help in your rotation, what you can also do is just make sure that you're always looking at the scene in the same direction. And that helps. So continuing the rotation clockwise. And then what you want to do whilst you're doing that is, so trying to decide the rotational angle. So that's the position at that frame. That's the physical position at that frame. So you want to kind of, the rotation would be a sort of, I guess you would say that it's a tangent. A tangent to the average position from frame 1 to the next frame to the next frame. So because that's oriented that way and that's oriented that way, the middle frame should be halfway in terms of its rotation. And then just continue round. Remembering to rotate around the same clockwise or anti-clockwise axes. So that needs to be rotated a little bit more. And this is where it can get a bit tricky, remembering which way the rotation is. Because this is, so this is where it gets tricky, because the temptation is that from that pose to that pose, you only need to rotate it, let's say, like that, which is anti-clockwise to the rotation that we were using, but that doesn't address what looks to be an almost 360 rotation between the two frames. And we can see that by let's press the N key. Right, so our Z value, although it's saying 275 degrees there. So what's the rotation at the next frame? Is just 28. So we need that to go negative. So we need to rotate this, even though it's, let's just do that again, even though the turkey faces the way that it is, so it's basically looking at the feet of the avatar, the actual angle is incorrect relative to the position of the previous frame, because it's spinning as it turns. So we need to decrease that so that we turn the rotation into negative values, but still end up with the character looking at the feet of the avatar. So this in theory should, yeah, there we go, and that's fixed that problem. And then with the last one, instead of 0, what you can do is just type a value in there, so that would be minus 360, I guess. And that will, it won't appear to do anything, but that should mean that as we back out of the animation, the pose continues and follows through. Yeah, so just to recap for the latecomers, hint hint. So that's what we did, as Deb's just pointed out in chat. So just to recap, yeah, so just to recap, we've got the root furniture node. This does not change, we don't do anything to this. This is the master node of the furniture item. This is what IMVU uses to locate the object in a room. We've then got our character animation. This might be a bit tricky now because we've got a sequence associated with the... But we've got an armature that controls a hop rather. That makes the mesh jump up and down, but that is then controlled by another node, and it's this other node that we actually move, and that means that we've got a bit more flexibility. Well, we've got a lot more flexibility actually, because it's the way that if you think about it in the way that computer games work. What we've essentially done is we've created a repeating cycling animation for the character. So the character itself isn't moving, it just cycles through the same hop animation. So if it didn't move, it would just be hopping up and down on the spot. So what we've then done is for the forward motion, or motion, however the thing needs to move, we've essentially created a node, a control node, that controls its forward motion. So the analogy would be that if it was a computer game, you've got your cycling animation that hops up and down, but when you press WASD, your keyboard controls, to move your character forward, you're actually moving a control node, not the animation. You're not changing anything to the animation, or you're not necessarily loading up an actual animation where the character is actually walking. All it's doing is cycling through the character standing on a spot, appearing to do the walk animation, but the actual motion, forward, backwards, left, right, up, down, whatever it is that it's doing, that's controlled by a control node that the character is linked to. And that's essentially what we're doing here. So this means that the character can have all sorts of different animations assigned to it, but you can use different sequences for whatever motion you want it to do. And the advantage of this as well is that let's say, for the sake of argument, this is only 70 frames long, this circular loop. when that's brought into IMVU, that's about the same length of duration as the actual hop sequence it is. So this thing will hop quite quickly around the loop. So what we can do, because we've separated the two out, so we have the control node and then the armature, we can load the two into IMVU and then set the frame rate to be much slower for the control node without influencing or affecting the speed of the playback of the actual hop sequence. So you can independently adjust the speed of playback or the number of times it loops or whatever it is that you want it to do. You can adjust those independently of one another. So once you've got your sequence, if you want to adjust, because that is quite quick, so what we might want to do is scale this up. So we can select all the nodes, the keyframes for the node, and then you can either press the S key, whoops, it'll scale from the position of the timeline scrubber. So press the S key and you can just scale up the node set as you would do with, so let's say, so the start frame now is at 1 and it ends at 170. So what that should do when it's played back in IMVU is allow time for the character to hop up and down several times as it moves through the loop. So now that we've done that, save the file, save as 23. So so Leon is asking about how is each spot the turkey hopped into would be applied. Well, so if you've got you have to do a little bit of math for some of them, but not all of them. It depends on the sequence. So we know that the hop, the actual hop of the mesh going up and down, is 70 frames. You can adjust that if you want, but for the sake of argument, we know that it is 70 frames. We also know that the node loop is currently 170. So what we can do, a simple way of doing this is thinking of so multiples of. So if you want the character to hop up and down 3 times within the duration of it spinning, so what's that? 3 7s are 21. So we'd need to adjust the length of the node control sequence so that the end frame is, what did I say, 3 7s are 21. Never do math on the internet. So we need this end frame to appear at a 210th frame. So that should mean that the loop will take 210 frames, and within that 210 frames we should get the turkey jumping 3 times, which is 70. It's best to do this in terms of the number of frames that you're using, not the time it takes for the animation to, because the turkey might take 2 seconds to jump up and down, but your loop may actually be longer than 2 seconds. So you could, I suppose you could do it that way. So if it took 2 seconds to jump up and down, and you wanted it to jump up and down 3 times, you would set the frame count so that you would end up with 2, 4, 6. So the loop sequence would be 6 seconds to allow for the turkey at 2 seconds to jump up and down 3 times. So depending on your proclivities with math, you can either calculate it by frame duration or time duration. Yeah, never do math on the internet. So, with that adjustment made, it's a good job you rose that point actually, because we would see an error. Well, not an error, but what we would see is if you get the timing wrong or you miscalculate, what you'll find is that, well, it's like a lot of the, well, pretty much all the dance poses. All the dance poses do exactly the same thing. You know, the character will move, and then it'll suddenly switch. It's because they haven't set the loop rotation properly. So it jumps from one position to another because they haven't compensated for either the length of the animation sequence or, which is usually the case, the difference in the positions between the start and the end of the animation sequence, because all they've done is just basically dumped a file into 3D Studio Max or whatever it is and just exported that to get their dance animations. They haven't looked at actually correcting the issues that doing that raises. So do we save this? We save this. No, we need to save this because we've made the adjustment. So save again. 24. Yes, so that's 24 different iterations of the turkey. And then export, and this should, so again, this is another one of those, not entirely sure this will work, so we are doing an experiment again. So hide that, because we don't need that. So just to recap, we've got our furniture node that controls everything. We've got our character node or control that controls the character's rig and the mesh. Then we've got the character's rig, which controls just the mesh. So export. So we've got, with the character rig selected, we've got the character sequence. With the node selected, we've got the node sequence. So just save over that again. So this is where we do some experimenting. Select the furniture node last. File, export, FBX. We want selected objects only because we don't want to export everything that's in the scene. Geometry, make sure use modifiers is disabled. You can leave, this is optional, apply modifiers is optional. Make sure always that add leaf bones is disabled. And then in animations, disable NLA strips and force start and end point. So double check selected objects. You can leave scale, don't need to do anything with that. Geometries, optional, apply modifiers. Armatures, make sure add leaf bones is selected, and then disable NLA strips and force start and end. And then we just save. And that's created our FBX, which we should now be able to load into IMVU. So create, derive new product, furniture, which just brings in the chair. So that's our default derived item. So we go through the FBX import process. So FBX import, load FBX, find the file that we just exported, robot Turkey 24, open. And this opens up the select skeleton root box. Generally speaking, it'll give you a couple of options. And because of the way that we've set this up, we want to keep the structure that we have in Blender. So we've essentially got what the FBX thing is doing is interpreting the armature, this, as a hierarchy, as a structure or an element within the hierarchy. So there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4. I wonder if it's, yeah, so it's doing the bones as well. So that's 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So the skeleton that controls the mesh is 5 elements in Blender. 1, that's the root node, control node, and the bones. But FBX considers the armature itself an object within the hierarchy. So it actually displays 6 bones when it's imported, and that's the one that we want. It shows the mesh, that's okay, configure. So this brings in all our sequences. And it'll sometimes, it duplicates some of them, but just bring them all in. Mesh, we need to auto-assign, not auto-assign, we need to make sure that that overrides the default, so that's 0. Change the scale, 0.01. Leave the axes alone, and then double check materials. Yep, armatures, animations. We can check the armature actually in here. See, so we've got the root node, we've got the Turkey control node, and then we've got the armature itself that's considered a node, and then legs, toes, and torso. So that's the hierarchy of the skeleton. Import. It'll give us the overwrite errors. Okay. And then, as per usual, click Apply Changes. And there is our turkey. So we need to go into Config. Make sure that we're using the same or the right skeleton, which we are. Double check meshes, materials. We can sort that out in a little bit. So actions. So let's load in Turkey move. Room. Want this to loop infinitely. Same ensemble. And then in the skeleton animation, we want, which one do we want? What did we call it? Turkey hopping. So turkey hopping. It'll be either armature or turkey hopping root. I think it's that one. Playback speed, we can leave that. Replace. Want that to loop infinitely. Leave all of those. Apply changes. So if you type turkey move, so that's the furniture control node that's doing that. The furniture node is static, it doesn't move. This is the control node that's moving. Now I have to remember, yep, we're missing the first animation because I was just double checking to make sure that it was actually going to bring in the sequences. Now, what you do now will depend on how you want your character to function. Because you can use different trigger words to do different animated sequences. So excuse me. So what we could do here is create another animation or another action. Call this turkey hop. Room. Make that infinite. And then in the skeleton animation bit, we want... It's given us two of those. Oh, turkey bob and turkey hop, so it's turkey hop. We want that to loop, and we want it to replace... Whoops, that's playback speed, not that one. Want it to loop infinitely. That's right, okay, yep. So apply changes. So if we do turkey hop, we should have oops, did it do it? No, hang on. Turkey, oh there we go. Turkey hop. Okay, that's actually quite funny. Right, so what you could then do is turkey... Did we do turkey move? Turkey move. Was it turkey move? Yeah, turkey move. Got to make sure that you click the 3D view, otherwise the text doesn't. There we go. So it's a little rough, but you get the point. And what you can then do is, because what this allows you to do is the circular sequence is completely independent of what the turkey itself does. So that means that you could use the same base rotate around your character, around your avatar, but trigger completely different animations. So there could be one where he jumps really high, or he falls over, or he rolls. But you could do that, you could repeat that same sequence in a cycle on the same core rotate around, maneuver around the avatar. And that's what this allows you to do. So if you separate the two out, so your animation for the actual character and then the animation of the furniture item, it allows you a lot more versatility and flexibility in terms of how you control your character or what it does, And this, of course, is a furniture item. So, I mean, if you wanted to put a seat on this, you could do that and turn this into some sort of fairground ride with robots. But you'd have to... I can't remember off the top of my head how you trigger all multiple animation sequences at the same time. I mean, you can, with this being a furniture item, if these were the only sequences, you could probably trigger both of them at the same time, I guess, using stance idle. And then change that to stance idle dot idle. So this will just trigger, it'll trigger both of them when the furniture item is dropped into the room. Because you have to be careful, well, not careful so much as, that's probably the wrong word, but if you add sequences to the ensemble section, what it does is it plays through the ensembles. But if you want several animations to play at the same time, it's generally better to create separate actions and then trigger them depending on how you want the behavior to operate or function when the item is loaded. Or, I mean, you could even do, for instance, if this... Let me just do that so that I can reset the object. Turkey move. And then turkey hop. Right, so it's not doing anything at the moment because we haven't triggered it. But what you could do with the furniture item is that if this had a seat node, you could trigger the animation sequences when somebody sat on the robot. You would need to use that's sitting, I think that's stance.sitting. I'd need to double check that. Stance.sitting or stance.standing, or if it's a custom pose, stance whatever the pose is. But that would mean that both sequences, if you use the same trigger, both sequences would play when your avatar sat on the object. So again, you've got, and of course if you're using different sequences or different animations, you could have different sequences play depending on, so if this were a multiple seat pose item, what you could do is say, let's say for the sake of argument, the avatar grabbed the tail of the turkey, which put the avatar into a pose that looked as if it was being pulled along by the turkey. So you could do a different set of triggered poses or triggered animations depending on that pose, as opposed to one where the avatar just sat on the top of the body. But separating the animations out, doing this using nodes for the control of the movement, the global movement, and then an armature for local control of the skeleton mesh, you've just got infinite amount of flexibility. So yay for FBX. So let's just save that. Save as FBX Turkey. Hop. So, any questions? Questions? Whoops. So yeah, just remember to break everything down into components. So you're controlling your mesh using an armature, and you're controlling your furniture using a node, and then you should be okay, should be good to go with that. And then on export, remember to, particularly for the animation settings, remember to disable NLA strips and force start end keyframes. So Hot Rod's asking, adding second ensemble. It depends, because the ensembles, that's what the avatar is doing. If you note that after a couple of seconds or whatever, the avatar changes the position, that's because it's cycling through a list of ensembles that are in the ensemble section of the, the action sequence. So if you wanted, let's say for the sake of argument, you had the turkey, it was tipping forward, or there was another animation that had it tipping forward and pecking at the ground, or tipping forward and rotating its head to look to the side. What you could do is, so you'd have 3 sequences in the ensembles, and you could set these up so that essentially these would be the idle animation of the character. So when it loads, it automatically starts to cycle through the ensembles that you've listed, so that it looks as if it's actually doing something, as opposed to just standing there as it's doing now. It's not doing anything. So with ensembles, you can add a bit more life to the character in the same way that the avatar is. And this isn't even a pet, this is a furniture item. So you could make a furniture item look and behave in some respects like an avatar or a pet. Yes, you could, as we could. Well, you can go back, Frenzy, and make the character much more complicated. And again, you see, this is the advantage of splitting the project up like this. You could alter the armature, which controls the mesh. So we could add a tailbone to this. So I could duplicate this and create another bone, which would be the tailbone, or we could create more of them and create bones for the wings, for the head, for the beak, and we could animate all of that just specific to the turkey or to the mesh, and then leave the control of its movement, its motion, to the control node. That way you can set up simple looping animations that do whatever it is that you want it to do without necessarily needing, because you could, in fact, yes, you could probably do that. What you could do, obviously, is it's not moving at the moment because it's not doing anything, so you could set up a default sequence where it just stands where it's, where it loads up, but it could be pecking at the ground. So you could trigger that set of animation sequences, or you could do a different combination where you trigger it to move. So keeping everything separate in this way gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of the combinations that you can come up with once you've got your basic animations in place. We might, I might do it offline. I'm not entirely sure yet, but we might do it offline, because obviously one of the problems that you then encounter is, obviously, whilst you have more flexibility in terms of what it is that you can get your avatar, the item product, the furniture item, you have more flexibility in terms of you can get it to do. But the flip side of that, or the downside, is that it makes the project slightly more complicated and time consuming. So this turkey is controlled at the moment by 3 bones, just 3 bones. But if we add a bone for the tail, that's 4 bones. If we add a bone for each wing, that's 5 and 6 bones. As if we add one for the head, that's 7 for the beak, upper beak, lower beak. And what about the dangly bit? Whatever they call these things. Do you want bones for the eyes? So that's you're approaching a dozen bones to do all of those other things. So yes, you can do whatever it is that you want it to do, but obviously it starts to make the project complicated and time consuming. So we could go over live via Twitch, adding wings and tail and all the other bits and pieces, but that addition would take time to do. It would take more time to sort out live. Well, it's not live. It would take more time to sort out than we have available when we do these live casts. So I might do something offline. So just looking through the chat, see if there's any other questions. Why did what break, Frenzy? Spooky robot eyes. What box? Yes, yeah. If you get stuck with something, just email. That's fine. Yeah. Oh, okay. Frenzy was trying to make something and it's not working the way that she's expecting it to, so Right. Yes, well, double check you've got your materials and textures assigned and that you are in texture display mode or viewport shading. I just call it display mode. Makes it easy to understand. Just make sure you're in texture display mode so that you are seeing the textures, because it could be that just inadvertently you've got either this selected or that's solid mode, or you've somehow inadvertently set the maximum draw type to solid or something else, which you can do because this is controlled by shortcut keys. So you could very well be inadvertently pressing something and basically fire off nuclear missiles using Blender. Oh, it could be. Do you still looking at Frenzy? So this is whoops. This is Frenzy's thing that she's having trouble with. So let's move this to her. Just a quick look at that. It could be that if you've still got the lamp object in the scene, it could be that that's just making the scene and everything in it just look dark. So if you select the lamp object and delete it, see what happens then, just to remove that as a possibility that's causing the problem. Oh, you're very welcome, Debs. That's the whole point of all of this stuff with the FBX is to help you guys make stuff and to realize is not the right word, but I think you know what I mean. Make you realize that it doesn't have to be super duper complicated. If you just break projects down into their component parts and just deal with each bit separately, and you'll make your way through it, and it doesn't have to be super duper complicated. Yes, I don't have lamps. Yeah, what can sometimes happen with lamps is I probably won't be able to replicate this right now because it never does. Right, I don't know if... Well, that should be coming through on scene. That might be what's happening. So it could be that your lamp object, if you've got one, is super tiny in the 3D view, because obviously Blender's scale is tiny relative to IMVU. So if you're doing something and you've already scaled it up to IMVU size, it could be that the lamp object is super tiny, which makes everything look black because the light isn't powerful enough on its own to illuminate much of the scene. So let's do a under the chin, that spooky horror look. That's flashlight under the chin. But if that happens, just you can, if you do have a lamp object, just select it and just delete it. And it'll force the scene to just be flat lit. Okay, well, if friends, if you're still stuck with that, just I'm guessing that the object was supposed to be a surprise, but if you're getting stuck with it and frustrated, just send it through and I'll take a look at it. I mean, it's likely just a very simple oversight, nothing to particularly worry about. Through what? Email. Email me the file. If you're struggling with the file, friends, you don't... This is the thing that... one of the reasons why we're doing this Twitch stuff is that if you do get stuck with something, just send it through via email or contact me on DMs or whatever it is, and just send the file through, because there's no point there's no point in you working on something and being afraid, to use that word, it's not the right word, but we don't want you being afraid to ask questions and seek help, because if you don't, you're going to get stuck, and the chain reaction is you'll get stuck, you'll get frustrated, you can't fix the problem, and you'll quit. That's not an indictment of you as an individual. I'm not speaking, I mean you in the general sense, not you as the individual. But this is what happens. This is why a lot of people stop doing 3D or stop doing creating generally, is because they get frustrated, they don't have anyone to ask, or they are concerned, afraid, whatever word you want to use, and they just stop doing it. They just leave the project, they stop the project, whatever it is that they're working on, and just don't go back to it. And that's what we want to avoid with all of this with this FBX stuff and with these Twitch streams. Yes, it's a lot of fun, we learn a lot, but at the same time we want it to be a helpful resource, so that if you get stuck, just contact us. That's all you need to do. Just whether it's a personal message on IMVU in particular, or sending the file through email. Obviously, if you're sending it through email, let me know whether it's going to be a large file size, so that it doesn't get blocked. But that's what we're here for. We're here to help you get to grips with creating. Yeah, so I mean, I can only speak for myself in terms of the people that provide the people that provide support. Don't be afraid to get in touch when you get stuck. That's what we're here for. So yes, 5 years of gritted teeth frustration could have been avoided with an email 5 years ago. Yep, and that's fine. 1 megabyte or so, that's fine. You send that through if you want. I mean, we won't take a look at it now, obviously, but I'll take a look at it offline. Yes, as Deb said, and this is generally the case. You are with much better people who want to inspire you, not retire you. And that's, just think of that in the broadest sense. So if you get stuck, ask questions. I mean, that's what these, partially what these streams are for. Let me just do something else. That's just got me thinking. Eyes shadeless. There we go. Glowy eyes. So he's lit and shaded by the lamp. But because we've got multiple textures assigned, we can fiddle around with the way light behaves, and you can do this to an extent in IMVU. This is full bright, so this is flat lit. Oh, well, it's not flat lit. Well, it is flat lit. It's full bright. In IMVU, the equivalent to that would be self-illumination. So you can't see it now, but you could set this up so that if the robot loaded into a dark room, which I don't currently have, his eyes would appear to glow in the dark. Yeah, you can't see it right now because the room's well lit, but if this were loaded into a dark room, his eyes would glow. So there are lots of things you can do, lots of things you can play around with. Add you where, Debs? On, you mean on IMVU or on Twitch? Yes, it's Catspits. The Twitch name Catspits is just related to Catspits.com, the website. But on IMVU, it's just JazzCat. I don't have to follow you, do I? You just, if you subscribe, then aren't you? At least I think that's how it works. To be careful with that, Debs. Whilst the effort is greatly appreciated with the subs, be very careful with that, because YouTube looks down on that in quite severely. They don't like people doing things to artificially, what they would regard as being artificially inflating their subscription numbers. So only subscribe if you were going to subscribe, and only encourage people to subscribe if they were going to subscribe. That's the only way you can do it. Otherwise, you can find your channel penalized. In fact, I did write something about that recently, but yes, well, it's appreciated, but don't do anything that could be interpreted by YouTube or any of these services as you trying to artificially inflate your subscription numbers, or your follows, or your likes, or anything like that, because they look down on that kind of thing pretty harshly. And yes, as Liana's now saying, just being here is fine. That's all you need to do. If you like what you see, so here's the plug. If you like what you see, subscribe or follow or click the button, whatever it is that Twitch does. Alright folks, well we've come up on our 2-hour session time. Could have started a bit earlier, but wanted to give some of you fans of Jinx and Prim time to recuperate from the shenanigans that they got up to. So that might likely be a common theme for the weekend broadcasts, is allowing you time to recuperate from those two. Alright then, we shall call it quits there then, and so as you can see, keep your projects, break your projects down into components. You'll get greater control over the end result, but you'll also simplify the production process in terms of what it is that you do. So as long as you do that, you'll be fine. Yes, oh yes, so Tuesday, the next... No, what day is it today? Saturday, Sunday morning. Might do something tomorrow, don't know. But failing that, Tuesday, that's when the next official IMVU stream is with Shannon Mac. Helping him... Oh, I do love saying this. Helping him make love in Blender. Sarcasm, sarcasm. End sarcasm. Yep, alright then. Tuesday it is. Bye for now.